lot of the spending on DE&I investments is not producing outcomes. And so when we're repeatedly doing those things and investing resources there, where could we be putting them instead in order to drive real meaningful change in the workplace?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Profit to the People, the official podcast of Republic, where we believe you have the power to invest in the future you believe in. I'm your host, Lisa Carmen Wang, and I'll be taking you behind the scenes to meet the team, founders, and investors in our community who share their insights on the future of investing and how they're bringing profit to the people. To learn how you can invest, head over to republic.co and follow us on all socials at Join Republic and at Lisa Carmen Wang. Today, I'm here with Racquel Joseph. She's the Chief Experience Officer at Kindred. Kindred is an executive community for leaders invested in environmental, social, and governance, also known as ESG issues. And they provide resources and community to navigate today's economy with confidence. Racquel, welcome to Profit to the People.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa. I can't wait to have this conversation today. And I love y'all's tagline. I truly believe that as leaders, we have to invest in the future we want to build.
Awesome. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of ESG, how to measure the impact of ESG initiatives, and how, as leaders, we can navigate some of the most important decisions around key issues like DE&I and climate sustainability. So, Racquel, I'm really excited to dive into this. So just to get started, could you tell us a bit about how Kindred really supports and hold leaders accountable to their ESG goals?
Absolutely. So Kindred supports our community with resources, learnings, and community to help them navigate the stakeholder economy with confidence. It is moving quickly, and we can't expect leaders to know everything on these huge spans of topic. And so Kindred was developed to support them in the moment, to gain confidence and to gain personal connectivity with the issues that matter most to our leaders' stakeholders. When I say stakeholders, I'm talking about their employees, their investors, their board, their consumers, their communities. We offer a blend of proactive support. So when something is happening in the world that impacts those stakeholders, we'll provide a framework, an expert, a space to talk about how to respond to those moments. And then also consultative support. So members can come to us for custom research requests, coaching and things like that to prepare them to lead in a way that aligns with their values. And then as far as accountability goes, Kindred itself, we don't hold leaders accountable to their ESG goals. We provide containers for community accountability. When these folks want to be in a space with their peers and demonstrate leadership on the issues, we want to make sure that there's a space where they can hold each other accountable, push each other forward, and see and celebrate progress.
So let's get specific. What are some of the most common ESG goals or common ESG issues that leaders are tackling today?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, environmental, social, and governance covers a huge span of topics. And what I'm seeing right now, and this shifts constantly because leaders have to shift and move their feet constantly. But what I'm seeing right now is a particular focus on DE&I and accessibility, and also sustainability and climate. We're coming off the heels of COP26. We're talking about rejoining the Paris Agreement. Those things are things that leaders are no longer ignoring, and they're being pressed on by some of their most important stakeholders, like their investors and their board.
Got it. And can you tell us about what are some of the goals or initiatives that people are implementing?
Sure. So if I think about DEI and accessibility, some of the areas where people are really investing and trying to expand their understanding are certainly anti-racism. That's been a topic for many years now, but of particular focus in the last year and a half or so since the George Floyd murder. DE&I in the workplace takes a lot of forms, especially since many of our folks are overseeing global or hybrid workplaces. So that can look like a particular focus on employee resource groups and DI councils and supporting those folks, inclusive hiring. So starting to tap into underemployed populations like folks with disabilities, veterans, or neuroatypical folks, and making sure that they have inclusive and supportive environments for those folks to thrive. And then also really looking at how D&I leadership and strategy is built into the structure of the org. It's really impossible for these initiatives to thrive if the workplace itself is structurally designed to kill them, right? If we have people who are not able to retain the right employees to drive those things forward, or if they're not given adequate governance or budget roles, that's going to be a big challenge. Shifting over to climate and sustainability, a lot of it is focused on community impact. So folks are really starting to understand the depth of their organization's impact on the communities in which they operate, whether those are overseas production facilities, even like overseas shipping and call centers and things like that, all the way down to the consumer habits that they're either encouraging or supporting. So for instance, your product in its very nature encourages people to overbuy or waste. How can we, look at redesigning that in order to change the consumer behavior and still drive the growth of the organization? So there's a wide range of initiatives in there, but hopefully that gives you a snapshot.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was reading about was actually the corporate accountability gap. So it's great to have all of these initiatives. There was a stat that I read from the Creative Investment Research Group. Of the $50 billion that corporations pledged to support racial equity, only $250 million had been spent or committed to a specific initiative. So what do you think about that gap, and how do we, to the point of accountability, actually hold leaders accountable, or what needs to happen for leaders to actually act upon the initiatives or the statements that they're making around anything from diversity and inclusion to climate change?
This question really inspired a lot of how we designed the experience for the Kindred community. We understand that people will not actually feel the urgency or make progress against these things unless everyone feels like ESG is a part of their job, unless everyone feels the pressure of expectation from their stakeholders that they change the way they lead. And so when we're talking about corporate organizations, like, we know that companies aren't making decisions, people are. And so a lot of the work that we do around leadership development, which we mentioned is like a resource that Kindred provides, is about helping people gain not only like personal connectivity to these issues and understanding their stake and creating their urgency and their mission against these issues that impact their stakeholders, but also giving them the tools to drive change. I think we all know change management is incredibly difficult. It's one of those things that when you have a competency in it, your career will go far. But when we're talking about change management around things that make people deeply uncomfortable, or that people have only a certain level of awareness around, that's a whole new ballgame. And so a lot of our work is about equipping leaders with the tools that they need to navigate resistance, to navigate burnout, to build resilience, to build empathy, cultural competency, cultural awareness, so that they can bring a lens of DE&I to every decision they make, not just the ones that they're tasked to, by the organization. Like, oh, well, now your compensation is tied to X DE&I initiative. Those advances are fantastic, but that means that you're going to see change in that one area. We're looking to transform the way people lead to be more supportive of these initiatives. And so when we're talking about that corporate accountability gap, we actually worked with this great agency called Savan around what they call the walk, talk delta. So what they're saying in public versus what they're doing internally at their organizations, that's the delta. What they're doing internally at their organizations is not solved by those big pronouncements and by putting funding against initiatives. Those internal structures are all down to the leaders themselves making real change. And so that's where we at Kindred focus, and that's how we feel we can help people who honestly are very committed, but they need that path to change. And so that's where we like to focus our time and how we're planning to close the corporate accountability gap.
Great. And so there is one word that you mentioned that I think is really important, which is awareness. Right. And there's the public awareness, but there's also the self-awareness as leaders, because that's where it starts. So are you working with leaders who are already aware and ready to commit? Or are you also working with organizations where leaders perhaps are even, still skeptical about closing that walk-talk gap?
I think we definitely err on the side of folks who are already committed. This is a community of people who are invigorated and passionate about these issues. But at the same time, they're evolving issues. What you need to know about DE&I today is quite different than what you'll probably need to know in a few months. And that's one of the reasons why we need to be really responsive to what communities need to understand around these issues. But it also means that we all have to respect that we're on our own journeys. We all have blind spots, especially in this huge umbrella of issues that we simply don't know. We can't expect everyone to be an expert on everything. So commitment and knowledge don't necessarily go hand in hand. And it's a shifting paradigm. So I think that if another tool that we're really trying to help people build is an understanding of this is an evolution. This is something that you're going to have to do forever. And that's okay. It's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to be difficult and it may cost you something, but we know that it's worth it. And that's why we drive these issues forward.
In the topic of DE&I, can you talk about what you're seeing in terms of the evolving role of Chief Diversity Officer and how are different companies implementing that? What's working, what's not working?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to sidestep a little bit and say one thing that we're seeing is a lot more organizations appointing like a chief purpose or a chief impact officer. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing that shift is because of some of that resistance that you mentioned, where the organization isn't throwing the governance and the budget and the resources behind folks with diversity in their title, which is frankly frustrating, right? We know we have all those business cases, we have the use cases, there's data on data on data, and yet we're seeing people come in again and again and kind of get that old okey doke where they think they're coming in to drive change. And then they're just hitting hurdle and barrier. So when you have someone who has like a chief purpose or chief impact officer title, generally that person does report to the CEO, which is incredibly important as far as ability to drive impact. And then they house several different parts of the strategy and how the organization approaches their work. And so that allows them a lot more oversight and ability to drive initiatives forward, including diversity initiatives. Now, I don't think in any way chief diversity officers are not necessary or are not incredibly essential to the work of organizations who want to lead on ESG. I'm just noting that sometimes a little bit of a positioning shift can make a big difference in their ability to be impactful.
And so when you're talking about, it seems like this evolving role to have chief impact officers, are you seeing that becomes more broad? So impact, not just being in DE&I, but also in sustainability and supporting other causes?
Spot on. That's exactly right. So you might have someone that has some oversight in product development, in vendor selection, partnerships, as well as like the internal people culture. And that gives them a lot more leeway to close that accountability gap and the walk, talk, delta that we were just talking about.
For the chief impact officer, what are specific ways to effectively measure the impact of their initiatives?
When we're talking about measuring impact, I think that there's a lot more framework and standardized reporting around the E and the G in ESG. So some of those might include, and we see this a lot, alignment with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, compliance with sustainability reporting frameworks like the GRI. And then when we look at governance, there are all types of certifications around like human rights, board diversity, et cetera, that organizations lean on in order to prove their progress and impact on the E and the G. The social piece is a little bit more difficult for most organizations. You can do count metrics around employee diversity, around vendor diversity, but it's a bit harder to quantify things like community impact. And so we see a lot more variability across how folks are reporting on that. One thing that I would say is developing a similar level of rigor on the S, the E and G, is where we see organizations separating from the pack and really becoming leaders in the space. So for instance, if folks are pursuing a place-based philanthropy approach, you might see that their measurement standards from location to location are as rigorous as you would see in their sustainability reporting. So it's really about the internal discipline in order to measure what matters on each of those counts.
And for the issue of board diversity, actually, I was reading an article about this, and you just mentioned that. So again, this goes to the walk, talk, accountability piece, where there's been so much diversity push to nominate more underrepresented ethnic and racial groups into boards. However, only 12.5% of board directors are part of these underrepresented groups. And so despite all of it, all of the talk, right? What can we do to push this forward in terms of walking the walk?
Absolutely. So one thing that's great is that we're seeing new requirements like those recently put out by the SEC around board diversity. We're seeing states take the lead in jumping out in front around policy in California and other states to ensure that organizations have to have the board diversity because it's simply fulfilling their responsibility to stakeholders to maximize their profit and utility. Those aren't things that I normally say, focused on the issues that I am, but the science and the data is there. And so when organizations fail to fulfill that gap, that diversity gap, they're actually failing their stakeholders. And so when we're talking about how to push it forward, I think that the advocacy and public policy engagement is incredibly important. If your organization is already a couple of steps ahead of others, you should definitely be in the conversation about pushing policy and requirements forward. If you're not in that conversation, you're just patting yourself on the back about your own progress, that's not really going to get us anywhere. We're all in the same boat here. So using your organization's voice around public policy engagement, not just for board diversity, but for any of these issues, climate justice, community impacts, taxation and transparency, it's needed, it's necessary. And I think that type of pressure, peer pressure and consumer pressure is what's going to take us to the next stage. So yeah, get out there and amplify these issues.
And that leads me to my question around any specific recommendations that you have for stakeholders. Sometimes a lot of people aren't necessarily in those positions of power and leadership to feel confident enough to champion the issues that they care about, whether that's climate change or racial justice or diversity inclusion. So what can an individual do who's at a workplace to talk about and push forward issues that they're passionate about in the workplace?
That's a great question. I love this question. I work in the community, quite senior executives. One of the reasons why we work with quite senior executives for the most part is because they do have power and because they can also structurally create workplaces where more people will feel comfortable coming forward and voicing their passion around issues. Now, that said, there are many things you can do. There are things that I've done throughout my career, which have led me to the point of wanting to transform the workplace to be more supportive. I think one of those things is absolutely working on employee resource groups and councils. Now, I have my qualms with those groups, right? We're asking people to do uncompensated culture work that directly contributes to the bottom line in most cases, though some organizations are starting to compensate and think about ways to make those things more equitable. They're showing up with your full identity and calling out areas where you are potentially feeling marginalized, whether that's on the basis of class or race or any other identity parameter. Is risky. I'm not saying that there are not risks to those, to standing up and pointing a finger at a challenge, but it is real. The next one I would say would be not to skimp on the inner work. We all have biases. We all have blind spots. And so by investing in our own development on the issues that potentially make us uncomfortable, it's a lot easier to bring other people on the journey. So it's really about modeling and also talking about the work that you're doing. And then fourth, we all have platforms outside of the workplace that can influence our workplaces. So being conscious of opportunities to weigh in on public policy, to advocate on LinkedIn, looking for opportunities to join boards, especially for nonprofits that need capacity building, where you can use the resources and power that you do have at your organization to support causes. There are always people looking for engaged board members. And then I would also say, getting thoughtful about how you tell your story, using your social platforms, using LinkedIn, which is becoming increasingly friendly to creators, to establish your narrative. And it will be noticed. Like we see organizations tapping the employees that have a voice out in the world to help them understand their workforce and become responsive to it. So those are some of the ideas that came to mind immediately, but I'm sure there's so many more out there. I hope that folks will drop additional ones in the comments.
Yeah. And I think that another thing that is almost quite challenging is this feeling that there's so much that needs to change. As stakeholders. It's like, you also care about climate change, but you also care about gender equity, and you also care about racial equity. And do you think it's more effective for people to focus on one issue that they can go really, really deep on, or to talk broadly about all of these on their platforms?
I truly believe in picking a lane because we have a ton of obligations as individuals. We have family, we have work, we have friends, we have our own health and needs. And so by picking a lane, you allow yourself to focus your energy in a single direction. Now, that doesn't mean that if I'm very focused on climate, I don't care about DE&I, because we know the intersection of environmental racism and sustainability and climate justice is born, right? So there are ways to talk about these other issues through your particular lane. And that's something that I myself try very hard to do. The other part about picking lane is choosing your strengths. So if you're a communicator, you don't need to go pick up a whole new toolkit right now to start working in this space. Find the messages you want to amplify and tell those stories. If you're a connector, find the people in your network who are passionate about those issues and bring them together. There are so many different ways to deploy the skills that you have now in support of these causes or these needs that we have to progress, and they are urgent, right? I mean, we're looking at the face of multiple crises. We will feel the impacts of the work we do or don't do for generations. And so I think that just bringing that level of urgency and passion to this work is important. Working in solidarity and working in humility is also important.
Amazing. I think just to repeat some of those things to really hammer it home, like the importance of choosing a lane. But I think this other thing that you mentioned, and it was interesting because you brought up two skills around communication and connection that are normally seen as quote unquote soft skills, which I think that even that needs to be rebranded. But so there's that. And then the urgency and passion with which you do things, because it will resonate so many generations after.
Very, very true. Soft skills does need a rebrand. I mean, when we're talking about leadership development, we're all in on soft skills. Empathetic leadership, you see it everywhere. And I think that when we are talking about personal connectivity to issues, we're talking about empathy. Many of the folks that are in positions of power, they don't necessarily have as many direct impacts, right? So the empathy is a critical skill in order for them to affect change in the areas of ESG.
So how do we build empathy? Like when we talk about soft skills, I think oftentimes the reason it's branded as soft skills is because they're less tangible than, say, coding. And so how does someone build better communication, become a better communicator, or become a more empathetic leader? Are there structures or processes or even questions that you ask the leaders in your community?
So at Kindred, when we're looking at how to improve communication and empathy, we really focus on curation. We bring in all different types of experts to help our members upskill in these areas. Give you a concrete example. We focus a lot on equitable leadership. Are you leading your teams and organizations equitably, where you're considering everyone on equal footing, and not necessarily everyone is equal, but that everyone is on the same starting line? And so what that might look like is examining how your culture or your own leadership style support oppressive power structures. If, for instance, you favor perfectionism or written over expression, those are things that historically favor certain groups of people. And so by changing those things or being aware of those things, you automatically improve your empathy. You automatically consider the fact that just because someone prefers to express and verbally process, that does not mean that they are not as valuable a contributor as someone who writes everything in a nice detailed report. These are like very concrete skills and things that anybody can learn. And I think when everyone applies that equitable lens to their own style, they cannot deny that there is a gap there in their value and how they're actually leading. And we've seen people make very transformative changes in their culture just by understanding some of those parameters. So we're really helping people just discover new frameworks, discover their own blind spots and biases. And honestly, if you're invested in this, you will naturally gain those skills. It's not like you're going to take a class on communication by being in this community, but you will grow exponentially just by being willing to look and examine your own actions and leadership.
And so what does that look like let's keep going with this example around written versus verbal. Does that look like a company putting together more meetings, more discussions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really more looks at a perception. So it gives us an opportunity to examine how we perceive certain contributors' inputs. So if you work with someone who is constantly sending you pre-reads for the meetings and is completely buttoned up, and I think we all have coworkers like that in every meeting, then that's great. That does not necessarily mean their impact is any different from an employee who comes in and draws on the whiteboard for an hour. Their outcomes can be equivalent, but our perception of them is not going to be equivalent if we're subscribing to the current power structure. So it's not that there necessarily needs to be a big structure change in how many meetings you have or how you run meetings, though those things can be very helpful. It's really just more about being honest about and objective about how you're evaluating or how you're taking in information or how you prefer information. All these things that seem like preferences can actually be things that uphold inequality in the workplace.
So it's really about a shift in perspective, because I think that's really important to note, because oftentimes when leaders are thinking about the change they have to make in meeting ESG goals and being more inclusive, there's a feeling of, we have to do more work. We have to have more meetings. We have to do all the other things. And when in reality, it sounds like it's just much more about being aware.
Very much more. Yes. I think we all know people are short on time. And when we're presenting people with 10 hours of training, I think those things can be quite necessary, but they're also stagnant. Like the issues move on. Our employee and our workplace force changes and that moves forward. What can you take forward with you? Perspective, understanding, awareness, having a well-developed lens is more important than probably sitting through 8 hours of training.
So then to that point of training, how do you see that training structure changing going forward? Should people still be going through hours and hours of training? Should they be going through short training spread out over time? Or should it just, what does that look like?
Those things are so unique to culture and to the individual. I love a training, and I think that those trainings can be very effective, but we also see the headlines and we understand that a lot of the spending on DE&I investments is not producing outcomes. And so when we're repeatedly doing those things and investing resources there, where could we be putting them instead in order to drive real meaningful change in the workplace? So I think constant evaluation is important. I think people should go to those trainings. I think people do need to have their minds open. Some of them are very effective. But I think it's also important that as leaders, we also have an objective understanding of what did we expect to get out of this? Did everyone just feel good after this training? Or are we seeing the downstream effects of equitable design and equitable practices in our organizations?
Got it. And so for people going into those trainings, what kind of mindset do you prime them with, or say that?
Oh yeah, vulnerability, humility. Those things are very important and very difficult, I think, for people to kind of drop their work facade and enter a space where they will be wrong, where they will be loud and wrong, maybe. I think there should be a whole training on how to be wrong. I think that would really help a lot of people. But yeah, vulnerability, humility, and also commitment. I think that if you're going in the mindset of obligation, you're going to take away a lot less than going into the mind frame of commitment. And also understanding like this is absolutely supportive of your entire life. I think we all have to have difficult conversations with all manner of people in our life. We all have to have deeper understanding of folks who are very different from us. We're seeing the generation below, younger than us, diversify, change how they identify, change how they interact in the world and their expectation of the world. and no one wants to be left behind. We all need to be current and understanding and growing. Otherwise, why are we doing the work that we do?
I think those are some great last words to finish with as you think about how you can go into the workplace or go into different conversations with some more vulnerability, some more humility, and really empathy to listen to other perspectives. And last question for you, Racquel, what does profit to the people mean to you?
Oh, profit to the people means two things. For me, it definitely means new models, new approaches to how we generate wealth. I think a lot about shared value frameworks that allows folks to benefit more equitably from the work that they put into building brands, organizations, communities. And then I also think about financial health and the investment that organizations can make in ensuring that their employees have access to financial health, whether that's providing a living wage, whether that's right-sizing benefits for marginalized communities, whether that is paying people daily instead of holding their paycheck from week to week. I mean, there's so many ways to operate that line, but I think the definition of financial health is expanding rapidly, and I'm really supportive of that movement. So that's my understanding of profit to the people.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for the work you are doing at Kindred and for sharing some of these really important ESG initiatives and the impact and how we as stakeholders ourselves can make better decisions and really navigate this world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
This podcast is provided for educational purposes only by Republic and Republic.co. Nothing discussed should be construed as legal, tax, accounting, or investment advice. The views of the presenters may not be the views of Republic and its affiliates. Always consult with trusted professional advisors before making investments. Private investments are inherently illiquid and may result in a total loss. All rights reserved.